It's the morning of September 11th, and we see how the passengers prepare to board their flight. On a day like any other, they grab their suitcases and the security personnel allow them access without suspecting a thing. The pilots and flight attendants smile and chat among themselves, completely unaware that in just a few hours their plane will be attacked, a strike that will leave not a single survivor. Right then, two passengers of Arab appearance exchange glances as if they were sharing a secret message. The men reach the gate, and the guards quickly scan them with an X-ray machine, give them the all-clear, and let them pass into the boarding area. Since after all there is no reason to be suspicious of the passengers, they look just like any other person on the plane. Moreover, the security check didn't raise any alarms. Still, something seems to be troubling these men, as they clearly appear nervous. The moment to board arrives. The first to do so, and to take their seats, are the Arab men, their eyes showing strong determination. The rest of the passengers board, stow their suitcases, and the flight begins. Once they are at a considerable altitude, one of the Arab passengers gets up to use the restroom, and there he begins assembling a bomb, initiating his plan. The other terrorists rise from their seats and start stabbing the crew using small knives, which, at that time, were allowed on flights, and subdue the rest of the passengers with tear gas. Desperation fills the cabin, and fear overcomes everyone as they realize that this could very well be the end. The terrorists manage to enter the cockpit. The hijackers take control of it and divert the plane toward New York. They also switch off the transponder, causing the plane to vanish from commercial radar. After a few minutes of flight, the terrorists at the helm spot their target, the Twin Towers. Meanwhile, while this madness unfolds in the air, on the streets of New York people are living a perfectly normal day. Some run through Central Park, others drive to work, and some are already in their offices, it being approximately 8:40 in the morning. These hundreds of thousands of people trusted that it would be just another day, but they were gravely mistaken. After 32 minutes of flight, the plane finally reaches its terrible target, and from that moment on, the world was never the same. People on the streets can hardly believe what they see. The city's most iconic building, and perhaps the country's most emblematic structure, is now a ball of fire, smoke, and rubble swaying high above. The passengers inside the plane lose their lives instantly, and many others in the building perish as well. Those who manage to survive are extremely injured and in a state of maximum danger, as the smoke inside the structure makes breathing nearly impossible while the flames intensify. Ambulances, police, and firefighters quickly arrive at the scene, and some of them begin climbing to help. However, what many do not know is that this hell is only just beginning. Reporters and media soon arrive and manage to record, from several angles, the destruction of the building's floors. While one reporter is preparing on the roof, suddenly a second plane appears and crashes into the other tower, creating a gigantic explosion. Firefighters act as fast as they can with the objective of evacuating survivors from the towers, as they could collapse at any moment. On the streets, people are extremely disturbed. From there they look in horror at the landscape, a building engulfed in flames with people struggling to fight for their lives amid despair. Many of those still inside the affected floors have no choice but to try to cling to the exterior of the building to avoid breathing in the smoke or being painfully consumed by the flames. Some manage to hold on with all their might, but others are not as fortunate and end up falling, to the horror of onlookers. At that moment, the President of the United States was George Bush. During the disaster, he was visiting a school in Florida. Initially, he was informed of an impact but was told it was an accident, so he remained relatively calm. Then, however, a security officer approached him again to report that a second plane had crashed and that the United States was under attack. The president struggled to keep calm as he finished his engagement and later retired to deliver a message to the country via a broadcast in which he revealed that the nation was under attack by terrorists. After this, he was taken to a bunker for safety. At the same time in New York, ambulances, doctors, and police did everything they could to evacuate and protect the people. Even some civilians stayed to help, but this could not last long, as 1 hour after the impact, one of the towers collapsed, even with people still inside. Clouds of dust, as tall as multi-story buildings, rose, causing people to run in terror in search of shelter. Some were swallowed by the dust and shards of glass, while others managed to take refuge in nearby shops and establishments, their faces covered in dust. That day, 2 more planes also crashed, one into the Pentagon and another that was headed for the Capitol. However, the passengers on the latter flight, Flight 93, fought fiercely against the terrorists to regain control of the plane. Unfortunately, the passengers were unable to save the aircraft and perished, but they did manage to prevent the plane from crashing into another building as the terrorists had planned, thereby saving hundreds of lives, though at a great cost. Once the situation in New York calmed, an investigation began into who was behind this tragedy. The search led the government to one name, Osama bin Laden, leader of the Al-Qaeda organization. American citizens mourned the nearly 3,000 people who died that day and demanded justice. For this reason, President George Bush decided that he would give them what it took, no matter the cost. This promise was made very clear in his speech in which he declared war on the terrorists. At the end of the speech, Bush clarified, "America's enemy is not our many Muslim friends nor our many Arab friends. Our enemy is a radical network of terrorists and every government that supports them. Our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every group with a global reach has been found, detained, and defeated." What very few people know is that, in fact, the group responsible for all of this was largely created by the United States government itself. In fact, here is a newspaper article where the US government speaks highly of bin Laden, since it was the same government that supported him in the first place. I know this may be entirely new for some, but let me explain. There are two versions of the story. One is the version we all know, in which the United States is the perfect victim, but the other is a bit more complicated. I'm not here to tell you what to believe, since even I am not entirely sure, but I'm here to present the other, more nuanced version of the story. Now then, oil is the engine that drives the world, and the United States was one of the first countries to realize this. The year is 1930, and an oil company from California finds a huge amount of oil in Saudi Arabia, so it builds a plant on site. The workers, along with their families, move from the United States, creating a strong American influence in the area, which the natives do not like, but the king does, as he is delighted with the wealth that oil has brought to the country. They become very permissive with the United States, so much so that they allow them to build a military base near the factory. Obviously, this causes discontent among many people, but since they are getting rich, it seems they can endure it a bit longer. Now the United States has the factory, houses for the families, and a military base in the Middle East. But all this infrastructure must come from somewhere, right? It turns out that the construction company hired to carry out many of these projects belongs to a man named Muhammad. This man has an enormous amount of money thanks to his large construction company, and he also has many children, but one of them is named Osama bin Laden. Time passes, and the discontent with the United States on foreign soil grows with the arrival of the 1960s. A new threat to the United States emerges: communism. Since the Soviet Union had very good relations with Iran, the United States pulled the strings to overthrow the Iranian government and imposed a dictator who bowed to its interests. In addition, it supplied Israel with arms to fight its conflicts and increased the U.S. military presence in the area. By this time, Osama bin Laden's father and his entire family were extremely rich thanks to their construction business. Bin grew into a young adult, more aware of what was happening around him, and he understood that his country's instability and the large foreign presence in his land were partly the fault of his own family, since they had built the foundations that allowed the United States to invade his home. He also felt that the presence of Americans in Saudi Arabia was an insult, as it is considered holy land for Muslims. This introspection led bin Laden to want to do something against the foreign domination over the Middle East, to fight for the freedom of his land. The first step on his new path was to move to Afghanistan, where he arrived with plenty of money, construction equipment, and, most importantly, a steely determination to fight any superpower that tried to impose itself on his home. He joined the resistance known as the Mujahideens and offered them his resources to wage the long battle ahead. His first target was the Soviet Union, which also had its hands in these lands, a fact that, obviously, earned him many points with the United States, so much so that American newspapers even published reports praising Osama as an anti-communist guerrilla, applauding his efforts. The United States decided to provide the resistance and Osama with support in the form of money, weapons, and training. That is how bin Laden was funded and trained by the CIA. Eventually, the resistance won and the Soviet Union withdrew, but for Osama, the battle was only just beginning. While in Afghanistan, he created his own faction of Mujahideens, with which he then returned to Saudi Arabia. The group was called Al-Qaeda, and its objective was to protect Islam and its traditions through violent means against external threats. Sometime later, a battle broke out between Saudi Arabia and Iraq over a small territory between them called Kuwait. Iraq and its dictator, Saddam Hussein, had a huge army, the fourth largest in the world at that time, so Saudi Arabia asked the United States for help, and they sent tanks, ships, warplanes, and explosives. In a matter of weeks, Hussein withdrew from Kuwait. The threat had been contained, however, the U.S. bases built to deal with Hussein remained, and this foreign presence was deeply resented by the locals and even more so by bin Laden, who, remember, was fighting to expel foreign powers from his lands and safeguard the Muslim faith. Bin then left for Somalia for a while to plan his attacks against the invaders, and from there he organized a series of assaults against U.S. embassies in Middle Eastern countries. By the late 90s, he began planning the September 11th attack, a tragedy that, as we have seen, caused hundreds of losses and would soon lead to something even worse, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. After the events of September 11, the United States decided to devote all its military efforts, thousands of troops and millions of dollars, to the search for one man and to put an end to him. They wanted to find bin Laden and bring him to justice, as that would put an end to the threat, or at least that was what it seemed on the surface. As the video goes on, however, we see that the interests were also strategic and economic, as shown by these impressive photographs depicting US soldiers in rooms and containers filled with gold bars. And it isn't just a photo, such images actually exist. Naturally, this has led many to think that, in reality, all of this was a conspiracy orchestrated by the US government itself, especially when you consider that beneath Iraqi soil lay some of the most important oil reserves in the world, liquid gold waiting to be extracted. But we will come back to that later. It is important to remember that the extremist group that carried out these acts, Al-Qaeda, had its base in Afghanistan, a country completely different from Iraq, separated by thousands of kilometers and with a different language. But if that is so, how did we make the quantum leap from wanting to attack a small group like Al-Qaeda to invading a country that had nothing to do with it? Well, pay attention. After the attack, George Bush was not entirely sure how to respond. Or at least, that was the case until a man named Paul Wolfowitz, the Deputy Secretary of State, also known as the architect of the Iraq War, arrived. This man planted the idea that the attack on the United States was a highly coordinated act. The capture of 4 airplanes, executed so flawlessly, could not have been the work of a country as underdeveloped as Afghanistan, and certainly not of a small, disorganized group like Al-Qaeda. According to him, the only explanation was that the ruthless Saddam Hussein, the dictator of Iraq, was behind it all. Many members of the government, not just Paul, were clinging to the idea of overthrowing Saddam Hussein and bringing freedom to the Iraqi people. Hussein was a ruthless man, and his dictatorship in Iraq, which would last more than 2 decades, was marked by executions and the repression of civil liberties. It's not difficult to see why so many wanted him out of power. These arguments were not sufficient reasons for the president or for all those involved in making this decision. So Paul, the architect, revealed some important facts. Some of the most important population centers in Iraq, and also those least fond of the dictator Saddam Hussein, were located atop the largest oil reserves. Therefore, it would be relatively easy to enter these cities, liberate them, and seize control of the resources, cutting off Saddam Hussein's primary source of income. The invasion would be swift, and the locals would see the Americans as the liberators of their democracy. This strategy would kill 2 birds with 1 stone. First, by securing oil and military control. Second, by showing the world, and their own country, that they had emerged victorious after the tragedy by achieving a clear victory, overthrowing a dictator and restoring a nation's freedom. We already have the objectives. Now all that was needed was the justification to invade a country that had done nothing. Remember, the supposed aid from Iraq to Al-Qaeda was nothing more than speculation. The response was simple: claim there were suspicions that dictator Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction that he could hand over to Al-Qaeda, with which they could perpetrate an attack even more brutal than that of September 11. In reality, there was no solid evidence of weapons of mass destruction. It seemed more like an invention by Paul Wolfowitz and his supporters. Nonetheless, the idea began to spread among the powerful politicians of the United States. After evaluating the situation, Congress voted, and the result cost hundreds of thousands of lives. On October 10, 2002, the United States Congress approved the invasion, the mission to overthrow Saddam Hussein's regime under the justification that he possessed weapons of mass destruction and supported acts of terror. The bombings were atrocious. US and British forces swept through everything in their path, and tens of thousands of troops and vehicles were deployed in the area. On April 9, 2003, the objective was achieved. US forces took the capital, and in a symbolic act, they toppled Saddam Hussein's statue in Firdos Square, marking symbolically the fall of the regime. On May 1, 2003, Bush declared the end of major combat operations in Iraq, suggesting that Saddam Hussein's regime had been successfully overthrown. All of this was done aboard an aircraft carrier with a banner in the background that read, "Mission accomplished." However, that wasn't entirely the case, as the ex-dictator was still at large and his whereabouts were unknown. This didn't last long, for just a few days later, a man who had gone from having power, mansions, and riches was found in a hole in the ground. He surrendered without much resistance and was later tried and executed for war crimes. It always seemed that the intentions in Iraq were twofold, but people began to suspect something was wrong when photos emerged of American soldiers in rooms filled with gold bars. Remember I mentioned this would be important? These photos were taken on the day of the looting of the Central Bank of Iraq, shortly after the dictator's fall. Although the gold was supposed to be handed over to the proper authorities, many of the bars disappeared, leading people to think that they were in the hands of soldiers or even American politicians. Although the missing bars were never recovered, this type of looting accompanied by photographs seems to suggest a message to the world: that the United States invaded Iraq for money. During the United States' stay in the Middle East, al-Qaeda weakened and fractured, but bin Laden, the main target, remained at large, or at least until the day of Operation Neptune Spear. Meanwhile, the war in Afghanistan continued with no end in sight. The CIA worked arduously on U.S. soil to capture all the remaining members of al-Qaeda in the country. They spent countless hours reviewing recordings of interrogations of al-Qaeda members, yet they could not get close to bin Laden. And let me tell you, the interrogation techniques used by the CIA became increasingly controversial, employing sleep deprivation, starvation, and other methods, with little success. After some time, they managed to intercept a phone call between al-Qaeda operatives. Thanks to this, the CIA discovered the whereabouts of a man named Kuwaiti, who turned out to be bin Laden's personal messenger. They located him in August 2010 in a village in Pakistan and followed him to an enormous mansion. The investigators were taken by surprise. Seeing the size of the house, they wondered if perhaps bin Laden was residing within that very complex. It wasn't certain that he was in that house, but when the CIA relayed the news to the capital, bin Laden was declared located, and the manhunt for the orchestrator of one of the worst acts of terrorism in history began. They monitored the house for several months and noticed that there were at least 3 women and 3 men present. One of them was almost certainly bin Laden. In February, President Barack Obama approved the operation, and preparations began to capture the leader of al-Qaeda. On the night of May 1, 2011, 2 military helicopters carrying an elite team of soldiers took off toward bin Laden's mansion. The CIA did not disclose their plan for that night for fear that information might leak and they would lose the target, but the special forces were determined to complete the mission at all costs. As they approached the mansion, the soldiers prepared with their night vision goggles. The helicopters landed in complete darkness. It was midnight, and nothing could be seen or heard from the house. The soldiers advanced, but just as they were about to force a door, someone on the other side fired at them. They returned fire, and when the shooting subsided, they called for Kuwaiti to come out. To the team's surprise, the person who emerged was a woman, who told them to eliminate her. They entered the room and found a man lying on the floor. It was Kuwaiti, lying lifeless. They then searched the rest of the rooms and saw a man running through the shadows. When they noticed he had a weapon, they shot him, and he too was neutralized. They still needed to check the second floor, but the door granting access was locked. So they blew it open with explosives. As they ascended the stairs, they saw a shadow dart toward the upper floor. They called out, and as soon as his head appeared, they shot him. The man who fell lifeless turned out to be one of bin Laden's sons. Upon entering the second floor rooms, they found a room filled with computers and files scattered everywhere. It was the main headquarters from which bin Laden directed al-Qaeda operations. The team continued, and when they reached a room on the 3rd floor, they heard noises and fired. They heard the screams of a woman, and upon entering the room, they found a man lying on the floor. Bin Laden was dead. And so, at the end of this entire conflict, powerful America managed to locate and disarm the supposed weapons of mass destruction, dismantle the terrorist networks they so feared, and free Iraq, right? In fact, no, they never even found any trace of these so-called weapons of mass destruction. The terrorist networks were not eliminated. On the contrary, they fragmented into smaller groups, one of the most important being ISIS. This organization, in the power vacuum following Hussein's death, caused even more conflict and instability, especially in Iraq. In 2021, when U.S. troops withdrew from Afghanistan, the Taliban regained power, sowing chaos and marking the beginning of a dark era. The most heartbreaking aspect of all was the loss of life and the massive destruction caused. A war that lasted around 20 years, in which hundreds of thousands of people died, both soldiers and civilians. Families were torn apart, and millions were displaced due to the ensuing violence. I'm talking about people who lost everything. Now that you have all this information, let's move on to the question posed at the beginning. Was the first domino, the towers, part of a premeditated act by the United States government to justify an invasion? Conspiracy theories argue a couple of things. First, they claim that until the collapse of the Twin Towers, no building constructed with steel columns had ever been completely demolished. The only way for those columns that hold up a building to be entirely destroyed would be through controlled demolition. Proponents of these theories propose that the government prepared the towers so that when the planes crashed, they would fall completely without a trace. Another point they stress is the inefficiency with which the entire situation was handled. When the government learned that the planes had been captured, the air traffic control institutions and the Defense Command took too long to react. Not to mention that this delay could have served as the perfect excuse to justify an intervention aimed at seizing resources, controlling territory, and, importantly, oil. A giant, attention-grabbing attack on an iconic building in a renowned location. And if I missed any other possible motive that might feed this theory, feel free to leave it in the comments so we can all read your thoughts. Many might also argue that the truth lies somewhere in between, that the United States suffered a terrorist attack for which it was unprepared, and only afterward did it mix that situation with other interests to justify invasions in other countries. That could be the case too. As the saying goes, history is written by the victors, but that narrative is almost never an impartial account. Rather, it is constructed to highlight triumphs, justifications, and convenient narratives while concealing contradictions and failures. In the case of the United States, its role in 9/11 and the War on Terror, we see a perfect example of how events can be narrated in a way that serves specific interests without providing full context. At first glance, it seemed very clear, a country defending freedom and fighting evil. But things become much more complicated when we examine the details: economic interests, hasty decisions, interventions that left entire regions in ruins, and official narratives that do not always match reality. We come to realize that there are no absolute saints or villains in these scenarios. There are agendas, human errors, and often disproportionate suffering for those caught in the decisions of the powerful. The full phrase about history is actually this: history is written by the victors, but we don't know it completely until we also acknowledge the losers. And by acknowledging the losers, I don't mean justifying their actions or ignoring the wrongs they have committed. Rather, it means understanding their stories and motivations in order to have a more complete and critical perspective. The complete history will never be simple or comfortable to accept, but if we aspire to truly understand the world in all its aspects, we must resist the temptation of simplistic accounts and always seek what lies hidden behind them.